philanthropists around democratic resilience. And it is my distinct pleasure to be moderating this panel under the title, Will the War in Ukraine Slow Down the Green Transition? We have a great lineup of panelists and only 1 hour to go, or even less so right now. With me in the room are Susi Dennison, Senior Policy Fellow at ECFR and the Director of its European Power Program. Edwin Bendyk, who's a journalist at Politica and a chairman of the board of Stefan Batory Foundation. And joining us remotely is Grabbe, Senior Advisor at OSF, and until recently a Director of Open Society European Policy Institute. Thank you so much, Heather, for joining us remotely, and sorry for not having you here in the room with us. Let me start with the following. I think it's a trick question that organizers posed this panel with. So let me start with the following. There's this saying to never let a good crisis go to waste. And it seems to me that COVID-19, a pandemic crisis, was a missed opportunity for the green transition. And there's good data to prove that. The recent paper published by Nature claims that G20 countries spent around 14 trillion US dollars on economic stimulus in 2020 and 2021 alone, and only 6% of that sum went towards cutting the emissions. Now, with the war in Ukraine, well, a number of challenges, but some quite obvious, some less so. There is a surge in electricity needs after the pandemic. It kind of coincided as the world rebounces. Again, there is an urgency to move away from fossil fuels, goes without saying. And but on the other hand, coal production is restarting to cover the demand. Now, I would like to think that green transition is a political topic as much as it is an economic one. And one could say that renewables could be considered a freedom energy, as someone put it recently. It goes without saying that these new division lines that are now shaping our geopolitics and this new geopolitical competition could be seen also as the opportunity to push climate agenda. And with COP27 in Egypt, I'd also like to ask the panel on what to expect. But first, let me start with a question to Heather, who is joining us from Brussels. Is that correct? No. Okay. Shame.
I'm joining you
from London. All right. Well, I wanted to say Iceland. Well, that's a great place to be. But I wanted to ask you for a view from Brussels, and I wanted to ask you how such a dominant topic as the war is shifting the perspective towards discussions on sustainability. Right? You spoke a lot and you wrote a lot about the need of engaging the public or the publics in the process of green transition. But then on the other hand, one could say that desperate times call for desperate measures, and in the times like this, deliberation comes second, and it's there's not always as much commitment to the process as it is to the outcomes. So a question to you: how the war is shifting those conversations, those hard conversations around green transition?
Thanks very much. I'm really glad to join you. Sorry, I'm speaking. Łódź is a great place, and I very much wanted to. I had to come to talk about the Arctic, partly because of the renewed interest and concern about what's happening in the region to our north, which we tend to ignore, what's really important. So I just wanted to three different aspects of what's happening now to green transition. I'm getting an echo. Are you hearing an echo too, or is the sound okay where you are?
There is a bit of an echo. I don't know if you can hear or see me, Heather.
Yes, I can hear you, Susie.
It's,
If you
Heather, it's
could
a little bit choppy.
stop.
Sorry, is there czy ktoś z obsługi
Do we have any technicians who would be able to help us with this connection?
I can manage if. Okay, now I can't hear anything from the room, which is fine, but I don't know if you can hear me. Is it okay? All right, fine. I will carry on. Thanks so much. So I want to talk about three aspects, three dimensions of the relationship between the war and the crisis in various fields that it has unleashed, notably in energy. With first is urgent, the second is perspective, and the third is information. In terms of urgency, you mentioned at the beginning of the session the question of desperate measures at times. And definitely the energy transition here means that we have come decisively out of quite toxic relationships, politically toxic with Russia, but also economically and environmentally toxic dependence on fossil fuels. So it's clear now there will be no to Russian gas. In a way, Putin put into the debate about that by himself.
We've lost you again. I'm sorry. It's a little bit choppy. I don't know if it's on our side or yours, but
I hear I still yes, hear myself speaking, but do you hear me better now?
that's much better indeed, yeah.
Great. Okay, I can still hear myself speaking, but I'll try. Okay. So on urgency, we've had some steps forward, we've had some steps back. Big step forward is that there is no return to Russian gas, and that changes attitudes towards building new gas infrastructure. It changes our attitudes towards where our energy comes from. And there has been a turbocharging of the energy transition. But there's still a lack of investment in the sustainable, renewable sources of energy that will go into the future winters. The desperate measures have been largely about this winter, which could be difficult because it's a big cold snap in November, December, especially if there's one in March, which gas storage will be much lower. But we need to be thinking about what happens in the next 2, 3, 4 winters when it's going to be harder. Can't rely on the gas now. And we're still not, as Europe as a whole, investing in what are ultimately the most secure sources of energy, which is the one closest to home. That's renewables, going on solar in the summer and in the winter, and conventional too. So the urgency has led to back. It's also changed perspective because it's not just experts who are aware of the hazards of energy dependence on a few monopolistic, more or less monopolistic providers of energy. The whole of society is aware of it now, and the whole of society is getting price signals, which show, again, the benefit of going into renewables as a longer term source of energy. So there's more demand for change. And there's also a shift in perspective from efficiency as the primary goal of many countries, efficiency of providing energy, for example, to resilience. And we see this across policies, not only energy, but also a lot of other economic policies, thinking about trade, for example, supply chains, localized, both maximum efficiency, so delivering goods at the lowest price, but now a lot more focus on resilience. And this also is, of course, the result of which revealed to the public just how much we are dependent on very long supply chains extending right across the world. But that didn't actually lead to any change. As soon as we went back to business as usual after COVID, we had a few things like the CHIPS Act and the focus on new sectors where some of the in the world is leading to a dangerous dependency. But we still don't have an overall approach to supply chains and to economic resilience. But we are moving in that direction. And then the third aspect is the transformation of mindset around security. And I think this is a transformation that is still far from complete. It started on the 24th of February this year, but it's still got a long way to run. And that's about what is security in the mind of the European public. What brings us future security? We see the downsides of interdependence in terms of security supply, in terms of energy, in terms of consumer goods and commodities and other things that we want. But there's also security in the military sense. And there is a big change when Sweden and Finland joined NATO, for example, big interest in investing in defence, with a huge amount of money now going in Germany. But what ultimately is that going to buy us? And we've also had an extremely hot summer this year and flooding in Europe. So we've had both droughts, flooding, and extreme temperatures, which has brought the physical changes that climate degradation is causing much more to the attention of the public, much more into the awareness of the whole society. And I think the danger is that if we don't pay attention to climate security, to stabilizing the environment, stabilizing the climate, as a key part of security, we're going to be in an endless cycle of crisis response. Now, that's very expensive in terms of public spending because crisis response involves unanticipated sudden spending. It's usually not very efficient. And also, it's politically expensive because it tires out public goodwill and faith in the political class, in politicians, in democracy itself. So we would enter into another cycle of crisis response, I think, at the peril of European democracy. And the physical effects of climate change are happening not only in Europe, but also elsewhere in the world. More than 33 million people are displaced in Pakistan right now because of floods. And that's because of glacier melting, as well as changes to monsoon patterns because of climate change. Those kinds of major regional climate-induced challenges will have spillover effects in Europe. We can foresee that in future years there will be water stress in North Africa, for example, the Great Danube River stopping to provide water, only source of fresh water to a large section of the coast. So problems with ice mountains and climate change, reducing the amount of groundwater available. That's right on our doorstep, much closer to Pakistan. It's going to affect a very large number of people. So getting out of the reactivity cycle is not only about ensuring new sources of energy that are not controlled by Vladimir Putin. We needed to do that in the short term. Have, in fact, responded to that with much more decisiveness and good planning at European level than perhaps could have been predicted if we'd been having this conversation this time last year. That's encouraging. But we are not doing the future planning about how to future climate-induced crises, which are not going to happen in 2040. They're going to happen really. The climate change is accelerating. It's getting faster and faster. We can expect more desperate times, more desperate measures, and we're going to end up squandering an enormous amount of money as well as political will if we don't actually implement the European Green Deal. And I'll just end on a hopeful note, which is that we can all criticize the European Union being a slow-moving, consensus-driven, lowest common denominator kind of political organisation. To misquote Winston Churchill, the European Union is the worst form of regional government we've ever had, except for all the others that we've tried over the centuries. What the EU is really, really good at is long-term planning and sticking to boring, technical, static-related progressive integration below the political radar. So things like the single market program, things like Schengen, things like, of course, the preparation for the euro, these are things which can survive changes of government and set the standards for now the Commission can really work on setting standards for a new green economy which prevent greenwashing, which actually cause a real move towards the things we need for our economic and political security in the future, such as a circular economy, which is much less dependent on these long supply chains and on relationships with other parts of the world, which may go wrong, and which then deny us things that we need, like, for example, Chinese-made solar panels. So I see many parts of the Green Deal beyond energy as critical to our long-term security, and they are things which are still happening under the political radar, thanks to this kind of very big policy work framework of the European Green Deal. To give people a few examples, the products initiative, which should be going ahead. Doesn't sound very sexy, isn't much mentioned in security circles, but actually having truly sustainable products moving towards a serious economy would make the European economy much less dependent on other parts of the world, much more secure. We wouldn't need to import so much. We also would need less energy to meet that because you can do demand destruction and permanently reducing demand for energy in through circular economy methods. So we need to look at materials, at circularity, and so on, which are the other less talked about parts of the European Green Deal, is actually fundamental to ensuring longer term security. So I'll just leave you with that idea about transformation of the European economy being a key part of responding to this present crisis and preventing future ones. Thanks.
Security. These are the topics that are, I think, especially important to be discussed not only at security conference in closed door fora, but also at festivals of ideas like this one, where there's a lot of citizens who are interested in those topics. But I want to turn to Susi with a question that actually nicely follows from Heather's intervention, right? So there is a lot of talk about geopolitical Europe. And I'm wondering whether geopolitical Europe is even possible without Europe becoming energy independent and transitioning away from fossil fuels. That's one part of the question. But a second part is also about the division lines that are, I think, quite visible from the outside, division lines in the EU. And I'm wondering how those new division lines that are shaping up in the wake of the war in Ukraine are affecting EU's ability to shape international rule-based order, and how does it affect EU's soft power globally?
Thank you very much for those questions. I'll try and address them all together, because I think that indeed the internal discussions within the EU are very much part of our ability to act, to be geopolitically capable or not. So, I mean, maybe a good place to start on this question of whether or not the next phase of Europe can exist if we don't move away from fossil fuels at speed and scale. I think I've been reading quite a lot of fairly upbeat stuff lately on the progress that we're making on this front, and indeed I was quite amused to see that Politico recently made Putin one of their green influencers of the year because of the kind of kickstart that his abhorrent war in Ukraine has had on us speeding up the transition, the energy transition. And I think this is all really good because it's important that we have a positive narrative about it being possible to do both, geographical diversification away from dependence on Russia at the same time as decarbonising and keeping our plans on course with regards to the Green Deal. And I think that that positive narrative is extremely necessary for a European population which is very fearful at the moment about hard security concerns, about the socio-economic situation, and indeed still, as we see in recent polls, including one which OSF commissioned ahead of UNGA, still very much concerned about climate change itself and wanting to see action on this front. But I think we also have to be clear under that narrative about this being possible that we're not yet there, that we're not necessarily in the place that we need to be on balancing the short-term needs with the long-term imperative to keep decarbonising. And a lot of the risks and the reasons that we're not arriving there are to do with us not yet being geopolitically capable. We haven't built up what a lot of the stuff that we write at TCFR about this we refer to as being our energy sovereignty. So our ability to work collectively together at European level on ensuring that we can manage the interconnections around energy that are necessary to us. So, some of the examples over recent months, the fact that we had to push Canada to circumvent its own sanctions, to send kit to repair Nord Stream 1, sort of indicates the extent to which we're not there yet. Now we have Putin telling us that Nord Stream 2 is the only way that he can supply gas to Europe, so we'll finally have to open it. And I think we are all aware that this bullying is only going to continue, and it's likely to get more and more difficult for us as Europeans to respond to as he becomes more and more desperate in an even more cruel phase of his war on Ukraine. And we cannot allow ourselves as Europeans to be in a position where we have to accept in return for our energy needs his actions which undermine the very principles which the European Union is based on, including the rule of law. So yes, we absolutely have to become more geopolitical, but we also need to be clear-eyed about the fact that moving away from dependence on Russia doesn't give us a sort of a clear path into resolving all of the problems around dependence that will still exist in the post-fossil fuel era. As Europe, we're never going to get to a place where we can be entirely self-sufficient for our energy needs. Heather's already highlighted some of the ways in which that is true around the green tech that we will need for this next phase, and the raw materials that will be needed to feed in that. We will be dependent on a strong set of relationships in the next era in the same way as we will as we have been up to now. But that will also be true, actually, of our need to import energy from renewable sources, that we don't have sufficient sunlight hours and facilities within Europe for solar to be a sort of a total solution. We don't yet have the storage technology around that, so we need to work on with other partners on building that up. Within Europe, we don't yet have in place the infrastructure that we need to build up the hydrogen sector. So all of this needs to stay on course. And this will take a lot of political courage to keep this investment going in a time when we're heading, again, as Heather's alluded to, into a set of very difficult years, economically speaking. And so this is why I think it's important that we come back to this question about the narrative on this process in order to build a European consensus around the need for what we could call sustainable energy security. And by sustainable, I don't just mean incorporating a clean dimension, although that's absolutely crucial, but also that it has the diplomatic network surrounding it for the relationships with other countries that will allow us to build that in a way which can endure changes in a turbulent geopolitical environment. I think this probably does mean thinking about relationships closer to home. in terms of securing these needs. I think it does mean that we will that has to be sort of set in a broader framework with the partners who are crucial to us on energy. And I think it does mean as well that we need to be thinking about what's the mutual benefit in these relationships that we're constructing around our energy needs. What is the component of them which is about building up the renewable sector in third countries? What is the component which is about developing together the tech partnerships that help us fill the gaps that we currently have in terms of building up Europeans' sustainable energy security as well. And maybe just to finish on a point about the divisions within Europe. I think it's very clear that one of the things that is going quite well in the European conversation at the moment is the willingness to cooperate on the demand side on the energy front and agreeing common targets to conserve energy as far as possible. But my feeling is that we haven't fully yet digested the fact that this is a Europe-sized problem that needs to be responded to on the supply side as well with a common solution. And it feels increasingly urgent that we plan jointly for this and coming winters about how we will deal with supply shocks when they come, and I think we can assume they will come, and doing so ahead of time will help depoliticize that conversation, that it doesn't become about taking heating away from French grannies in order to subsidize German industry, but rather it is a system which has been agreed ahead of time and that we've got the infrastructure within Europe to facilitate. And that seems to be something which is lacking at the moment. Just a final point on this, on overcoming the divisions within Europe. I think there is a big responsibility at the level of political leadership too, to tell the same story to European citizens, that at the moment we've had very divergent views in different member states on the extent to which responsibility lies with consumers or with industry or with governments for tackling the energy crisis. And that just doesn't work if what we're asking of European citizens is does involve some sacrifices and does involve some changes in the ways that they might have been planning to heat their homes this winter and so on and so forth. So that collective story about this energy crisis, I think, is also really important to create a Europe which can act cohesively and geopolitically.
Right, thank you, Susi. I now want to turn to Edwin. And great that you finished on stories, because I actually want to ask about stories. Edwin, I think of you as a person who lives in a frontline country and Poland, but also a person who understands Poland quite well, because you spend a disproportionate amount of time around Poland and outside of Warsaw, which I think is quite important. I want to ask you, what does war in Ukraine mean for a country like Poland that is so heavily dependent on fossil fuels, and what does it also mean for the Polish society? Because needless to say, for those in the room that are Polish, it is a kind of longing of a civil society to try to find threads and themes that would unite us as a society and kind of overcome the political divisions, right? I think Carl Schmitt used to write that nothing unites people as a common enemy. And I'm wondering whether this current war and in particular the coming energy crisis is a topic that potentially could unite otherwise conflicted factions in Polish society.
Thanks for this question, thanks for having me here. Let me switch into Polish, as I am afraid of my throat, and it's easier for me to control my voice speaking Polish. So Sorry for this change.
Indeed, the question is of extreme importance and difficulty to answer, because the war factor, the essential factor to which we know no answer, how the war is going to progress, and the forthcoming winter in Ukraine will not result in another wave of refugees who will first come to Poland. Our system has fully exhausted its capabilities. The system is fully based on local authorities and NGOs. The state system, well, the state has taken some regulatory solutions, but structurally not much has been done. And that is the basic question, because that is overlapped by the energy crisis. Part of the answer is that we cannot hope what we hoped in summer and autumn, that is energy supplies from Ukraine. They have a surplus, but in winter they will send energy to their own needs. We've been buying energy from Ukraine, and Volodymyr Zelensky said that we would provide energy to Polish friends, but until certain time. It only illustrates like the system of codependencies in Europe is important. We all time import energy from Ukraine, recently from Sweden. It's like a side note to what Susi said. An essential problem for Europe is what happened in France. So unlucky coincidence of events that resulted in maintenance work in atomic power plants were shifted to this year because of COVID. Half of the power is off. The power plants will be reactivated early next year at the earliest, but still they will only be able to work with 80% capacity. France, and that used to be the greatest energy exporter, is an importer today. It only shows how a coincidence changed the math. Now, get back to Poland. And the question how far this common challenge named energy can be a binding factor in the election year, not to forget it. This election year says something. It cannot. It would be the polarizing system that the government, who is aware that we are not prepared. Of course, it will all depend on temperatures, what winter we shall have, but we are not structurally prepared for this crisis. Therefore, the government started to play the game on shifting responsibility. It's like buying coal by local authorities. And it was a suicidal attack. The society doesn't understand that. The government aspired to be problem-solving government. It turns against its assistive rule. It says that local government should apply to the government for assistance. It all of a sudden says the local authorities should join the work. They are not appointed for that. There is a distribution sector for coal, 100,000 people working there. They can do the job. You need to communicate. That was bad action, purely political, and its goal was that local authorities dominated by opposition or neutral political forces to pull the local authorities into the game. The local authorities will anyway deal with the issue. At the end of the day, recently we've had a meeting with a group of local authority representatives from Poland. They participate in our program, and they are all aware they do have to handle this assistance, help, and devising the assistance like in the pandemic, like during the migration crisis, refugees crisis. You need to run a triage method. You need to find those who will not survive. Lonely people, people with disabilities, people with extremely low income. With the soaring prices, they will not be able to survive. That comes together with the local authority structural problem. An example, as we heard in our workshop, Pałąków municipality, 6,000 people, one of the poorest in the Silesian region. She has 11.5 million zlotys of the budget, of which 900,000 was allocated for electricity by old prices. If the prices go up, as negotiated now, by 300–400%, what can you switch off? You can only switch off street lighting and school. The school has no swimming pool, no concert hall, no infrastructure. They can only cut off the things I've mentioned. Then there is nothing else. This presents the scale of the problem for which there is no solution. And we can see that in the political space an intensive game is going on that is purely unclear. How can you explain those price shifts when the margins of state-owned energy companies is 70%? It's pure making money on the crisis. These are state-owned companies. There should be a political will to change the situation. Why isn't that happening? It is a very good question. It will happen one day, and it would be a great success of the government. But this is a situation, if we consider it's the end of October, it's a worrying situation. To sum up this current situation, the forthcoming winter, we can only hope that, like in the pandemic, like in the refugee crisis, together by the self-organizing civil society and local authorities, we will manage somehow, which is not sure any longer, because initial estimates show that 12 metropolitan cities will end the year for the first time in history with 10 billion zlotys deficit. That less money for crisis operations, rescue operations, there will be no money for that. That is a true issue. However, the situation looks better in long-term perspective. Nobody doubts in Poland that the transformation is a must. The question is about its form. The model as of today is that it should be a controlled transformation, controlled by the state, a model concentrated in terms of capital and politics. It is symbolized by the Baltic Pipe, a strategically successful investment, but considering Nord Stream 2, pretty unsure. We can expect a sabotage in here. When the Baltic Pipe was being erected, we could have built biogas plant in parallel, where a biogas production capacity based on waste would be 8,000 billion cubic meters, exactly as Baltic Pipe is supposed to bring here. This is negligence. It would be a dispersed system, several thousand of such biogas facilities, less susceptible to sabotage, malfunction, but there is a clash of philosophy of the state and understanding of security. We combine energy and security, and we see that the current political system thinks about security in all aspects: protection of the population, energy security, central authority controlling key decision-making and generating systems. That makes a sense. You can look for arguments in the world of present risks and threats for the infrastructure and the Ukrainian experience, where we see what decentralized resilience system means. It's very dangerous. We could see what happened when the Bełchatów power plant, the greatest one in Poland, went off. 3–4 units were down, and the power drop was by several gigawatts. So that is a clash of philosophies, which I hope, in response to the crisis and planning the transition, can be responded. Before this panel, we had round tables with idea-generating milieus. We spoke about transformation, and the moods were okay, positive. They comment on the politics, but they are not involved. It was like a consensus on the need to find the solution based on dispersed models, different forms of property, not only state-owned or capital-owned, but also cooperative forms. So the potential for the future can be achieved if we unlock the political option. Also, there's still the Polish society, still, despite polarization axis and its deep political division, and the issues regarding the transition, the need to put in new energy sources, the society is not divided that much. Of course, there is peace electorate opts for carbon and lignite, but it's not like religion division. It's like a shift within several percent. So the potential for transition, social readiness is high. We could see that when photovoltaic panels were mainly installed in rural areas on church roofs. So among the governing party supporters. So if the political campaign in the next year doesn't ruin that potential, and we should expect it should be brutal and use all the available measures, if that doesn't shift the division in this area, I hope it doesn't, and we do not blame the EU for the energy costs, then we can, if we survive the winter, we can start building a better future.
Vin, also for finishing on a hopeful note, because before I open the discussion to the audience, I wanted to run a final question to both Heather and Susi, actually about what brings you hope. What are you hopeful about when it comes to green transition vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine? Heather, do you want to start?
Sure. Well, the hopeful thing is that people have been shaken out of their complacency by this war. It's really remarkable that the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said in her State of the Union speech that Poland was right, that Poland and the Baltic states, by being hawkish about Russia, being worried about Russian ambitions and the autocratic turn, it meant that Russia was not actually a reliable partner, also economically, also in terms of energy security. That was quite something for a German Christian Democrat who served for, 14 years in Merkel's government to say. Quite something. And she's right that there was a huge amount of complacency about Vladimir Putin and his rule in Russia and the intentions of his regime for far too long. So we've been woken out of that complacency as regards the economic energy relationship with Russia. But the problem is we don't yet have anything to replace it with. And that's where we need to move into more sustainable thinking on our long-term security, as well as more sustainable thinking about our economy, how it works. We've also been shaken out of our complacency about energy and the amount of energy that we consume and the amount of materials we consume. We have enormously inefficient economies. They're efficient in terms of delivering more and more goods and services to us, but they're not efficient in terms of the toll that they take on nature and the capacity of the planet to continue providing these things that we think we need, capacity of the planet to continue providing human needs, and the enormous cost of our current model, our current economic model, in terms of the cost for future generations, for our children and grandchildren, is becoming clearer. And the enormous cost that it's going to have in terms of the cleanup we will have to do from future droughts and extreme weather and floods and so on is also becoming more evident. And that was the case in Europe this year, but it was also the case in the United States, really for the first time, which is something quite remarkable. How the environmental lobby in the US is now no longer just democratic; it's bipartisan. So this war is changing people's perspectives about how secure they really are. We've had 30 years of peaceful transformation and the reign of neoliberal economics and capitalism in Europe. Both of the premises underlying both our security order and our economic thinking have fundamentally changed this year. Some of them because of longer term trends. It's not just because of that. I'm not sure I would call Vladimir Putin the green influencer of the year. Thank you, Susi, for raising that. He is in the same way that Trump deserved the Charlemagne Prize for uniting Europe a few years ago, because you were quoting Maciej, the Carl Schmitt on nothing unites people like a common enemy. It would be dangerous if we thought that our only enemy was Vladimir Putin. He undoubtedly has put himself in that role, but the other enemy is kidding ourselves that we can continue just the way we have in economics and assume we will have both economic and physical security. We need to make these fundamental changes now. And this is tough. It's really difficult because our systems, as Edwin was pointing out, our systems are based on a lot of assumptions which are now being tested. And we can expect future power outages and problems. But that's not only because of Putin. It's also because, for example, the nuclear technology in Europe that many people now say is the answer. Actually, that stopped working this summer because the water levels were too low and because the water was too warm in the rivers for example, a lot of France's nuclear capacity to operate. So those kinds of challenges that we had never thought of as being a threat to our lifestyles, it's there now, and we need to be looking at it much more holistically and not just separating economics and security into two different baskets.
Susi, over to you on hope.
Yeah, I would agree with those sources of hope from, the strategic level. I would add to them the changes that we're seeing at the public level and in actual consumer behaviour. I was looking earlier this week at the massive uptick over the summer in purchases of heat pumps for housing across Europe, and the way that industry has suddenly started to boom. And similarly with the thinking about putting in place solar panels, we've seen huge increases in willingness to make those choices. And that seems to me to be a far cry from where we were back at the beginning of this year, when I think the Czech Republic was one of the first countries to talk about this idea of a campaign around turn down your thermostat 1 or 2 degrees to oppose Putin. And everybody I spoke to at the time said that's a crazy idea. If that's the best that we can come up with in terms of a sort of a collective response, that people have to make a sacrifice in order for Europe to be able to stand up to Putin over this, then we haven't got much hope. But actually what we're seeing is that people are willing to make that sacrifice and are willing to make the connection between the choices that we make collectively in Europe and the long-term future of our energy security.
Edwin, anything to add on hope, or we turn to the audience?
Lokalnie.
Locally, this time is important because at the end of the day, we are going to say goodbye to the myth of coal as the prerequisite of energy security in Poland. We'll give up on this fantasy. We had known it back in the 70s. I hope the political awareness will encompass that. It will speed up the transformation process in Poland. And as we were saying before, it's a source of hope for me is to discover there is no return to Russia as a supplier, a strategic supplier that we are dependent on, which means that diversification means that we won't be looking for similar supplier. More distributed ones without geopolitical interest will be of interest to us. So we turn towards Africa. It happened before war because there was European Union and African Union summit 2 weeks before the war, and many important questions with regards to future of transformation were discussed. Africa has got everything we need. We can utilize it. It all depends on political imagination. Africa has got what Europe needs. Europe has everything that Africa needs: technologies, capitals, and so on. So there is a huge chance, and Ukraine, as such, integrated in Europe in the domain of economy and policy and politics. It is not only geography, but also the resources that we have that need to be integrated. Knowledge, technologies, utilization of these in the chains connecting European systems. So there are many prerequisites, but we shouldn't be returning by inertia to the old methods of solving problems. And there is a risk that I'm going to indicate. Contracts signed at the moment by German utility companies on green hydrogen are input materials, exploitation type of model. Ukraine is treated as a prospective producer of raw material that German economy needs. No, it is coercion rather than win-win situation. We need to look at these. We need to criticize. Not only do we speak about Ukraine, similar solutions are proposed to African countries. This would be a cul-de-sac.
We have a few minutes left for questions from the audience. Are there any questions? Is there someone with the mic? Okay, we have questions.
Thank you. My name is Maria Zolkina. I'm Ukrainian political analyst working on regional security and conflict studies. I have a question regarding the influence which is being gained by right now by Rosatom, the main Russian energy company, because what we are observing is that while Gazprom and generally, let's say, fossil fuels capacities of Russia to influence European market and European countries are decreasing, Rosatom started just in July and in August started the new reactors construction in Hungary, which is EU and NATO member state. They have started construction in Turkey this year already, also at the end of the summer. They are studying the project in Egypt, which is less of, let's say, European Union interest, but nevertheless. So what to do, how to reach the balance, not to make specific NATO and EU countries fall in another type of energy dependence on Russia.
Okay, great. There was one more question, I think, so we can take it too. Can we get the mic there?
Thank you very much, Gabriela Lenartowicz, Polish MP. So I'd like to ask and at the same time express my hope that the situation that we are facing at the moment will support the return, and I want to ask about it, to return to greater social aspect of generation and consumption of electricity. We were speaking about subjectivizing Europeans in generation and consumption of electricity, how they produce, how they consume electricity. I'm speaking about this because technological revolution, digitization, management digitization is a proponent of energy safety diversification, and therefore we can transfer some of these competences to local milieus when it comes to near-field electricity. With today's dispersed energy sources management at the local level, we would, on the one hand, take off the load at the whole European level because the scope will be smaller. On the other hand, what one of the speakers said, we need to supply arguments for citizens. It's enough to give them power. Something that they can take care of themselves. This self-assistance, it is possible, and regulations should be also in place. What Edwin Bendyk was speaking about in Poland, in this geopolitical situation, it is impossible to introduce these kind of legal regulations. My bills are staying in the parliament freezer, and I cannot do anything about it. If we introduce these solutions, we would diminish energy poverty, and we wouldn't have the danger related to heat supply and smog before this winter. We would also protect ourselves against
I have two
any
questions
other.
and less
I
than
need to
4
stop
minutes
there.
to answer them. They're
3
not
minutes.
easy questions. First, how to reach the balance so we don't fall into new dependencies, and second, how to democratize consumption and production of energy and raise the agency of consumers. Are there any talks about that on the EU level? Any takers?
I don't mind. Yeah.
Okay, Susi, go, and then Heather.
Yeah, I mean, I would very much agree with the risk that you're highlighting around the risk of new of not a new dependency, but sort of hidden aspects of our continuing dependency on Russia, and I think this is absolutely part of what I was referring to when I said that we're not there yet in terms of having thought this all through, and the fact that we are still in a position where these kinds of projects can be set up within EU states underlines the extent to which we don't yet have full cohesion across the EU about what it means to transition to a situation which is long term, which is a long term new geopolitical reality in terms of the way we need to work without Russia. I think that the huge steps forwards that we saw in the first half of this year were very much in a crisis scenario, and an expectation that this could be something which could be resolved within a matter of years. I think we're now going into the harder long-term picture, and as part of that process, we need to be absolutely mapping where all of our ongoing dependencies are. Working our way out of them, and then thinking about in the next era how we avoid making those same mistakes in new relationships, because risks will always be there, and partnerships are never completely unchanging through the long term. So we need to future-proof our energy security by building up a range of relationships and by being sort of clear-eyed about what is in them. I think I'll leave maybe the other two questions for the other speakers because I've gone on too long.
Sure. Heather, 40 seconds.
Yeah, two quick. One is there's no point exchanging our dependence on one autocrat for our energy to a new set of autocrats. How great, it's not great that we're now doing new contracts with the Saudis and the Venezuelans. These are not regimes that we should be dependent on. Much better to do, in fact, what the second question was about, which is move to locally produced energy. The best and most secure energy is the one you produce nearest to you from your rooftop, through solar, from your local wind turbine, because that kind of decentralized local energy production is much more resilient. You don't have power outages because of a strike, for example, or a sabotage of a large energy system, as well as you're not dependent on foreign suppliers. So this gives much more power to citizens, because it lifts them out of energy poverty once that initial investment has been made. But also it's much harder to disrupt a centralized system. And if there's one lesson we can learn from Ukraine's amazing response to this war and huge resilience of society in Ukraine, of civil society, It's that the decentralization of Ukraine and the extent to which people are self-organized at local level is an enormous source of strength and resilience. Ukraine's small and medium-sized farms are continuing to provide food, which would not be available if Ukraine had a centralized agricultural system under the Common Agricultural Policy. It would be much easier for a foreign invader or aggressor to disrupt it. So this decentralization and local production is essential for environmental reasons, but it's also a really good source of security when we're going to have to live with Russia on the European continent. It's not going away for the future. So let's think about what we can learn from Ukraine's example.
I think looks from the organizers that they have to wrap up here, and I hate to do it, but I hope that we can continue this conversation offline. So thanks again, Heather, Susi, Edwin, and thanks for the organizers in the audience. Thanks a lot.
It's not always easy to recognize. It may look like this, or like this. It may be a burden, but it is a responsibility that we embrace nonetheless. But if it means this for one person and this for someone else, maybe it ultimately means being there for one another. It isn't handed to us, but we know where to find it and how it feels, how it tastes, and what it sounds like when we finally have it. It means different things to different people, but for many, it means everything. And if we all fight for it, it will eventually bring us together.
Atlas Network is, as the name suggests, a network, and it's global. We work all around the world. We're based in the US. We have about 115 9 partners in the United States right now, and the bulk of our partners are outside, nearly 500 in total.
Atlas Network, it connects people from all over the world defending the idea of human dignity, defending human rights and personal liberties.
Atlas Network is focusing on, I think, the most important and moral cause in the entire world.
We partner with local innovators, local leaders who understand conditions on the ground in communities facing real challenges. We look at the people from the worldwide freedom movement that are passionate, are ready to make a difference, understand local conditions, and we invest in them.
At Atlas Network, we unleash individual ingenuity to enrich humanity.
The United States does not have a lock on the idea of freedom and liberty. Those ideas are beyond borders.
One of the main goals of Atlas Network is to eradicate poverty around the world, and we do that by investing millions of dollars in our partners' work every year.
Historically, wealthy nations around the world have tried to help low-income countries develop. The way we've been doing it traditionally has not really been working. So there's a movement to do development differently, and that means we need to step back as outsiders and rethink the role that we're playing in helping people in low-income countries achieve their dreams.
We want to make the world a better place. We want to make the world a freer world.
All of us want to leave a legacy and be part of something big to make a better world. This is exactly the work of Atlas Network.
With our growing number of hundreds of successful partners, we're stronger than ever.
Changing the world.
Changing the world.
Changing the world
starts together with us.